Tonight, we walk into a word that once covered half the known world, and then slowly learned how to disappear. Tonight, we begin with a name that did not belong to one people, one empire, or one ruler, but to distance itself. Tartaria. On old maps it stretches like mist, vague yet dominant, a label placed where certainty failed and imagination took over. You are told it was a place, then a people, then an error. But what if it was something else entirely? What if Tartaria was not conquered in a single war, but quietly redefined until it no longer meant anything at all? So, before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. And as you settle in, I invite you to post your local location and the time you are listening from, because this story, like Tartaria itself, stretches across many nights and many lands. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You find yourself standing over a table, lit by a low, flickering lamp. Spread beneath your hands is a map, not modern, not precise, but confident in its uncertainty. Across the vast interior of Eurasia, in letters almost too large, you read the word Tartaria. No borders, no capitals, no explanation. Just a name filling the silence between known worlds. You feel how strange it is that a single word could stand in for forests, rivers, empires, and millions of lives, and yet explain almost nothing. At first, Tartaria is not Russia's enemy nor its goal. It is simply what lies beyond. To the early Russian state, clustered around rivers and forests, the East is not yet land to be governed, but space to be feared. Space where roads thin, where winter speaks louder than law, where stories arrive before armies ever do. Tartaria, in this moment, is not a political reality. It is a mental one. You hear the word spoken softly, cautiously. It does not mean nation. It means elsewhere. It means those people, those lands, that direction where control dissolves. Western travelers use it the same way, brushing vast regions with a single term because precision feels impossible. And so the name grows powerful, not because it is accurate, but because it is useful. But something begins to change when Moscow begins to change. You feel the tightening first in language, not violence. Chronicles grow more detailed. Rivers are named not just as features, but as routes. Forests are described not as barriers, but as resources. Fear slowly gives way to curiosity, and curiosity, as it often does, begins to sharpen into intent. Tartaria remains on the maps, but now it is watched more closely. You notice how this shift does not announce itself with trumpets. There is no declaration that Tartaria will be conquered or erased. Instead, there is a subtle narrowing of meaning. What once referred to a vast, unknown world begins to fracture into smaller descriptions, specific kanatas, specific peoples, specific obligations. The fog thins, and where fog thins, power follows. You ask yourself a quiet question as you move forward in time. Can a place survive once it is fully described? The early Russian state does not yet seek to erase Tartaria. It seeks to survive beside it. Tribute flows in both directions. Alliances are temporary, fragile, shaped by seasons rather than ideologies. The steppe is not empty. It is full of motion. Riders, traders, messengers, life organized not by walls, but by rhythm. And Tartaria, in this phase, still breathes freely. Yet even now, something is being prepared. You sense it in the way records are kept, the way names are translated, simplified, sometimes distorted. A people with many identities becomes a single category. A confederation becomes a stereotype. Complexity becomes inconvenience. And inconvenience, in the language of expanding states, is something to be corrected. Maps begin to betray their maker's intentions. Where once Tartaria sprawled proudly, faint lines begin to appear, tentative at first, then firmer. Rivers become borders. Forts become anchors. The name still exists, but it is no longer allowed to mean everything. It is being taught how to mean less. You are not yet watching conquest. You are watching preparation. Psychological, administrative, linguistic preparation. The kind that happens long before cannons fire. The kind that ensures, when violence finally arrives, it feels inevitable rather than chosen. And you wonder, was Tartaria ever meant to survive a world obsessed with definition? In this first quiet stage, Russian expansion is not a march but a lean. A slow tilt eastward, guided by trade, fear, rumor, and survival. No single ruler commands it fully. No single plan controls it. It is organic, uneven, human. And that is what makes it dangerous to names like Tartaria, which thrive on ambiguity. You feel the tension growing between two ways of organizing reality. One based on movement, memory, and oral tradition. The other based on paper, ink, and permanence. One tolerates uncertainty. The other is threatened by it. And in that tension, you begin to sense the fate of the word that brought you here tonight. Tartaria does not fall in this moment. It does not burn. It does not surrender. Instead, it stands perfectly still while the world around it learns new habits. Habits that will soon have no patience for a name that refuses to stay in one place. As you drift toward the edge of this opening chapter, the lamplight dims slightly. The map before you still reads Tartaria, but now you can feel it trembling, not from attack, but from attention, from being seen too clearly for the first time, and you quietly realize that in history, being fully seen is often far more dangerous than being misunderstood. You move forward without noticing a clear border, because in this time, there truly isn't one. There is no line you can step across and say, "Now I am no longer in Tartaria." Instead, there are rivers that grow wider, forests that grow thinner, and silences that grow longer. Before borders, there are only distances, and before distances are measured, they are feared. Tartaria lives inside that fear, fed by it, protected by it. You travel with messengers and traders who do not think in terms of empires. They think in terms of days, of horses, of weather. When they speak of the East, they do not list provinces. They tell stories. Stories of endless grass, of cities that appear and vanish, of rulers who answer to no throne that can be reached by road. This is how Tartaria is sustained, not by walls or flags, but by the refusal of the land to be summarized. You feel how early Russian authority presses up against this world cautiously. Power hugs the rivers, because rivers remember where they flow. The Volga, the Kama, the Oka. These are not yet borders, but lifelines. Along them, settlements cling like beads on a string. Beyond them, the land loosens. Control fades. Names blur. And into that blur, the word Tartaria expands to fill every unknown. There is a strange comfort in that expansion. To call something Tartaria is to admit you do not understand it, and to be forgiven for that ignorance. The name becomes a shield against responsibility. As long as the East remains Tartaria, no one must fully explain it, govern it, or integrate it. It can remain a backdrop for legend rather than a problem to be solved. But fear is never stable. You sense it changing as Russian survival improves. Winters are still brutal, but cities endure them more effectively. Harvests become more predictable. Armies become more organized. And as survival becomes routine, curiosity grows bolder. The same lands once dismissed as unknowable begin to look usable. Still, there is hesitation. You feel it in the way officials describe the steppe. Not empty, dangerous, not chaotic, unruly. These are moral words, not geographic ones. They prepare the listener to accept future action. When fear alone no longer justifies distance, judgment steps in to replace it. You walk through early chronicles and notices how Tartaria is no longer only far away but unsettled, lawless, in need of order. Each adjective chips away at the neutrality of the name. Tartaria begins to acquire a personality, and that personality is one that invites correction. Yet the people who live there do not experience themselves as living in Tartaria at all. They belong to clans, confederations, trade networks, seasonal roots. Identity is layered and flexible. Allegiance shifts with marriage, weather, opportunity. To them, the land is not undefined. It is deeply known. Only outsiders need a single word to hold it all. You pause and ask yourself, who benefits when a vast complexity is reduced to one name? The absence of borders is not an absence of order. It is a different kind of order, one that resists being drawn with ink. But ink is precisely what the Russian state is beginning to favor. Treaties are written. Tribute is recorded. Oaths are copied and archived. Each document freezes a moment that was once fluid. Each record insists that a relationship be permanent. You can feel Tartaria starting to stiffen under this pressure. Russian envoys travel farther, not always with armies, but with expectations. They begin to assume continuity, that a promise made this year will apply next year, that a leader today will still rule tomorrow. That territory can be tied to a name, and that name can be owned. These assumptions do not match the rhythm of the steppe, and the mismatch creates friction. That friction becomes narrative. Failures are blamed not on misunderstanding, but on the supposed nature of Tartaria itself. The land is treacherous. The people are unreliable. The distance is hostile. Each word quietly absolves the center of responsibility while justifying further reach. Tartaria, once a neutral fog, becomes a convenient explanation for every frustration. You notice how fear now works in reverse. What was once feared because it was distant is now feared because it resists control. And resistance, in the language of states, is rarely tolerated for long. Still, nothing has collapsed yet. No single campaign has redrawn the map. No decree has erased the word. Tartaria persists, but it is increasingly spoken about rather than through. It is described, categorized, anticipated. The mystery that once protected it is being slowly drained away. As you near the end of this chapter, you stand again at the edge of the rivers. On one side, record keepers sharpen their quills. On the other, the land continues to move as it always has. Between them, the word Tartaria hangs, still broad, still powerful, but now under quiet review. And you sense that once a place is reviewed, it is already halfway to being redefined. You feel the shift before you see it, because history often announces itself as pressure rather than spectacle. Ivan's shadow stretches long before his armies arrive. It stretches through letters, through demands, through a tightening sense that the rivers no longer merely connect worlds, they funnel them. The Volga is no longer just a route of exchange. It is becoming a corridor of intent. You walk beside messengers carrying seals heavy with authority. Their words are polite, even respectful, but beneath them lies an assumption that did not exist before, that the lands beyond Moscow are not simply neighboring spaces, but spaces that can be claimed. Ivan does not speak of Tartaria as an unknowable fog. He speaks of it as something that can be approached. This is where the redefinition truly begins, not with conquest, but with confidence. You notice how language hardens. Where earlier chronicles hesitated, Ivan's court writes with purpose. The Khanates along the Volga are no longer described as distant powers, but as obstacles, opportunities, or dependencies. The ambiguity that once protected Tartaria starts to feel inefficient. A growing state does not like what it cannot measure. You stand at the edge of Kazan's influence, feeling the tension in the air. This is not yet the fall. This is the moment before inevitability settles in. Ivan's shadow is not just military, it is conceptual. He believes in permanence, in walls, in inheritance, in lines that outlive seasons. And that belief alone is enough to unsettle a world built on movement. Tartaria, in this phase, is still intact, but it is being reframed. The steppe is no longer described as far, but as within reach. That small change matters more than any canon. Reach implies obligation. Obligation implies ownership. Ownership implies the right to rename. You hear the quiet reasoning repeated again and again. Security, stability, defense. These are soothing words, especially when spoken slowly, deliberately, as if they carry no cost. Ivan's advisors speak of threats along the Volga, of unpredictable neighbors, of the need to secure trade. Each concern feels reasonable. Together, they form a story that makes expansion sound like maintenance. And Tartaria becomes the backdrop against which necessity is staged. You feel the emotional distance shrinking. Where earlier generations saw a different world, Ivan's generation sees a problem to be solved. The East is no longer an abstraction. It is a frontier. And frontiers, by definition, invite crossing. When Kazan finally falls, it does not feel like a collision of worlds. It feels like a correction. That is how carefully the narrative has been prepared. The city is not described as a heart torn from Tartaria, but as a misplaced piece returning to order. The name Tartaria survives the event, but it loses weight. It can no longer claim Kazan fully, because Kazan has been given a new story. You watch how records change immediately. New terms appear, new titles, new classifications. What was once described through lineage and tradition is now described through administration. Districts, governors, taxes. The land does not move, but its meaning does. You pause and realize something unsettling. Tartaria is not being attacked directly. It is being surrounded by definitions. Ivan's expansion eastward does not erase the word overnight. Instead, it forces Tartaria to retreat from specifics. It becomes what lies beyond Kazan now, then beyond Astrakhan, then beyond each new fort. Like fog pulled back by a rising sun, it is still there, but only where light has not yet reached. You sense the psychological effect on both sides. For the Russian state, each success confirms a belief that order can be extended indefinitely. For the peoples of the steppe, the change feels less like defeat and more like intrusion, an insistence that life must now conform to schedules, borders, expectations that ignore the land's rhythms. Yet even resistance feeds the process. Rebellions are documented. Alliances are noted. Movements are tracked. Every act of defiance generates more paper, more clarity, more justification for deeper involvement. Tartaria, once protected by vagueness, is now exposed by attention. You notice how outsiders begin to adjust their language as well. European observers, watching from afar, start to describe Russian Tartary, as if the name itself can be subdivided, domesticated. A single phrase accomplishes what armies cannot. It suggests that Tartaria is no longer whole. And you wonder, did the name ever belong to itself, or was it always waiting to be claimed? Ivan's shadow lingers long after his death, because the habit he introduces does not fade. Expansion becomes normalized. Redefinition becomes routine. Each ruler inherits not just land, but a way of seeing land, as something that should eventually make sense on paper. By the end of this chapter, you no longer stand before an untouched map. Lines have appeared. Names have shifted. Tartaria still exists, but it now feels provisional, as if awaiting a verdict. The East is no longer feared for its mystery, but challenged for its refusal to fit. And as you step quietly into the next stretch of the journey, you feel the question deepen inside you. When a place is forced to explain itself, does it lose the right to remain what it was? You do not hear a trumpet when Kazan changes hands. What you hear instead is paper, the soft scrape of quills, the deliberate stacking of documents, the sound of a world being reorganized without asking permission. Kazan's fall is remembered as a military event, but what truly matters happens afterward, in the quiet rooms where names are reassigned and meanings are adjusted. You walk through those rooms now? The air smells of ink and wax. Officials speak calmly, as if nothing extraordinary has occurred. To them, this is not the destruction of a center of Tartaria. It is the correction of an anomaly. Kazan is written into registers as a possession, a province, a responsibility. And with that act, Tartaria loses one of its anchors. You feel how subtle the shift is. The word Tartaria does not vanish from maps overnight. It simply retreats. Where Kazan once belonged to a broad, undefined world, it is now folded into something narrower, something named. And that narrowing changes how everything else is seen. You notice how the language of conquest avoids finality. Instead of endings, it speaks of beginnings, integration, stabilization, protection. These words are soothing, especially when spoken slowly, as if meant to lull resistance into sleep. Tartaria, in contrast, begins to sound old-fashioned, imprecise, even lazy. Why rely on a vague label when a proper administrative name now exists? This is how erasure begins, not with denial, but with replacement. You move outward from Kazan and feel the tension ripple across the steppe. Traders adjust their routes. Messengers change their phrasing. Alliances grow cautious. The land itself does not react, but the people living upon it sense that something intangible has shifted. A center has been claimed, and claiming a center implies that the surrounding space can no longer pretend to be beyond reach. You ask yourself another quiet question. How many centers can Tartaria lose before it becomes only a margin? The Russian state does not rush. It observes. It records. It learns. Every tax collected, every oath sworn, every rebellion suppressed adds detail to the picture. Tartaria is still present, but it is being surrounded by clarity. And clarity is not neutral. It presses inward, demanding coherence. You notice how older descriptions of the region begin to sound out of date. Travelers' tales of endless freedom are contrasted with new reports listing garrisons, tolls, and governors. The mystery that once made Tartaria feel infinite now feels inconvenient. The state prefers what can be counted. Even the people themselves begin to be described differently. Where once they were simply Tartars, they are now subdivided, registered, classified, defined by obligations rather than by movement. Identity, like land, is being narrowed. You feel the emotional weight of this narrowing. It does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as routine. A new form to fill. A new title to accept. A new rule to follow. None of these alone seem overwhelming. Together, they begin to reshape reality. Kazan's transformation sends a signal far beyond its walls. It tells the steppe that permanence has arrived, that walls will remain standing, that records will be kept indefinitely, that forgetting will no longer be an option. Tartaria, which thrived in a world where memory lived in people rather than paper, begins to struggle under this new expectation. You watch European mapmakers respond almost immediately. Their atlases adjust. Borders grow firmer. Labels shrink. Tartaria is no longer the confident centerpiece it once was. It becomes a background term, something to be explained rather than assumed. And explanation, once offered, is rarely generous. Still, Tartaria resists quietly, not through unified rebellion, but through persistence, through roots that shift, through names that survive in speech even as they fade from official use, through habits that do not translate well into law. This resistance is gentle, almost invisible, but it slows the process. Yet the direction is set. You stand at the edge of the newly claimed land and look east. Tartaria still stretches far beyond what has been taken. But now you understand that distance alone will not save it. The state has learned how to advance without rushing, how to redefine without announcing, how to erase without destroying. And as you step away from Kazan's reorganized streets, you feel the word Tartaria grow lighter in your hands, like something being slowly lifted away, not by force, but by replacement. You follow the rivers south now, because rivers remember everything. They remember who traveled them first, who taxed them later, and who finally claimed to own them. Astrakhan sits where the Volga opens its mouth to the Caspian Sea, and you feel immediately why this place matters. This is not just a city. It is a hinge, a turning point where inland worlds meet open water, where steppe routes dissolve into global trade. When Astrakhan changes hands, Tartaria exhales and does not quite breathe back in. You sense how different this moment feels from Kazan. Kazan was a center of tradition, power rooted in history. Astrakhan is about movement, salt, fish, silk, silver, caravans, and ships. Whoever controls this mouth controls the story of where things come from and where they are allowed to go. And stories, you are learning, matter as much as armies. The Russian state understands this instinctively. Astrakhan is not merely conquered. It is repurposed, fortified, administered, connected. The river is no longer a shared corridor. It becomes a managed channel. Toll points appear. Permissions are required. Routes that once bent with circumstance are straightened by decree. You feel Tartaria tighten again. Where once the Caspian edge felt like a boundary between worlds, it now feels like a seam being stitched closed. The steppe behind Astrakhan is no longer an open backland. It is a hinterland, an area defined by what it supplies to the center. And the moment a land is defined by supply, it is no longer allowed to define itself. You notice how language shifts almost immediately. The steppe south of the Volga is no longer described as autonomous space. It is described as adjacent, connected, dependent. Each word quietly pulls it inward. Tartaria, once a vast exterior, is being drawn into an interior logic. You walk among traders who feel the change before anyone else. Paper follows them now. Licenses, seals, lists. They speak of delays, inspections, expectations. None of this is dramatic, but it is relentless. Movement acquires friction. Freedom acquires conditions. And you wonder, how many conditions can a way of life accept before it becomes something else entirely? Astrakhan's transformation also reshapes perception. European observers take note. They begin to speak less of an undefined Tartary and more of Russian-controlled routes through former Tartarian space. The emphasis shifts from land to infrastructure, from mystery to access. Tartaria is no longer interesting because it is unknown. It is interesting because it is being opened. Opened for whom? You feel how power now flows not just outward from Moscow, but downward through layers of administration. Governors answer to ministries. Officials answer to ledgers. The steppe, which once answered to weather and kinship, is being taught to answer to forms. Tartaria's great advantage, its flexibility, becomes its greatest vulnerability. Still, resistance flickers, not in grand battles, but in refusal, in delayed compliance, in routes that quietly change, in communities that move just far enough to remain inconvenient. These acts do not stop expansion, but they slow its digestion. They remind the state that control is not the same as understanding. Yet the pressure continues. Astrakhan allows Russia to look beyond the steppe entirely, toward Persia, toward the Caucasus, toward warm water dreams that stretch imagination even further. And as vision expands, patience shrinks. The state becomes less tolerant of spaces that do not fit neatly into its plans. You realize something unsettling here. Tartaria is no longer being redefined only because Russia expands. It is being redefined because Russia is learning to imagine itself as an empire. Empires require coherence. They require narratives that flow smoothly from center to edge. Tartaria, with its patchwork realities, interrupts that flow. So it must be simplified. Maps reflect this simplification quickly. Where Tartaria once filled entire pages, it now shares space with specific names, specific regions, specific claims. The font shrinks. The confidence fades. Tartaria begins to feel like a leftover term, something used when better information has not yet arrived. But better information, you see, is never neutral. As you stand near Astrakhan's walls, listening to the river move steadily toward the sea, you feel how irreversible this moment is. Control of the mouth means control of memory. What passes through here is recorded. What is recorded becomes real. What is not recorded begins to vanish. Tartaria still exists beyond the horizon, but now it exists in a narrower sense. It is no longer the world beyond Russia. It is what remains after Russia has taken what it needs. A remainder, a residue, a name waiting to be retired. You take one last look at the river and notice how calm it appears. Empires often move like this, quietly, steadily, with no urgency at all. And as you turn away, you carry with you the growing sense that Tartaria is not being defeated in battle, but in bookkeeping. And bookkeeping, unlike war, rarely leaves ruins dramatic enough to remember. You begin to hear the sounds before you see the structures, the measured stomp of boots, the short commands spoken in low voices, the dull echo of metal being set into earth. This is not the chaos of invasion. This is the rhythm of installation. Across the steppe, small forts appear, not as declarations of dominance, but as statements of presence. You sense how carefully this presence is negotiated. Treaties are offered before cannons are fired. Hostages are exchanged. Oaths are sworn under open sky. The language is respectful, almost gentle, and yet each agreement carries an unspoken truth. The relationship is no longer equal. Tartaria, in this phase, is not conquered. It is managed. You walk between worlds now, where soft power and hard power intertwine. A local leader accepts protection in exchange for loyalty. A clan agrees to supply horses or guides. A seasonal camp becomes a semi-permanent post. None of these acts feel final. Each feels temporary. But temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent once recorded. You notice how Russian authority prefers this method. It reduces resistance. It creates collaborators. It allows expansion to appear consensual. And most importantly, it produces paper, treaties, lists of obligations, acknowledgements of dependency. Tartaria is being translated into a language the state understands. You pause to reflect on how different this is from older forms of power. No single battle announces the end of autonomy. Instead, autonomy is eroded by layers of obligation. Each oath narrows the future. Each garrison reduces the space in which uncertainty can exist. The steppe listens. You feel how deeply listening matters here. Communities weigh promises carefully. They know that refusal brings force, but acceptance brings entanglement. They choose what seems survivable in the moment, unaware of how choices accumulate. Tartaria survives not as a unified front, but as a mosaic of negotiations. And mosaics, you realize, are easier to dismantle piece by piece. You hear cannons occasionally, reminders that politeness has limits. Rebellions flare and fade. They are met not just with punishment, but with further regulation. After each uprising, the records grow thicker. The rules grow clearer. The margin for ambiguity shrinks again. You notice something subtle and unsettling. Resistance itself accelerates redefinition. Every time the state is challenged, it responds by naming, counting, and fixing what had been fluid. Tartaria's flexibility, its refusal to settle into one shape, invites correction. The forts multiply. Timber walls at first, then stone. Roads form between them, shallow at first, then worn deep by repetition. Movement becomes predictable. Predictability invites surveillance. Surveillance invites classification. And classification is the quiet enemy of worlds built on movement. You walk along one such road and realize how different the landscape feels. Not physically different, but conceptually. This land now has expectations placed upon it. It is expected to yield resources, to provide soldiers, to obey timetables. Tartaria is no longer an open question. It is becoming an answer the state believes it already knows. Missionaries arrive alongside officials. Bells ring where there were once only drums or silence. Faith is offered as comfort, but also as alignment. To share belief is to share allegiance. Conversion becomes another form of inscription, another way to make the land legible. You ask yourself quietly, can a place remain itself once its spirit is standardized? European observers continue to adjust their descriptions. They speak of pacified Tartary, of regions brought under control. The word Tartaria survives, but it is increasingly modified. constrained by adjectives that imply completion. The idea that Tartaria might be dynamic, unresolved, or sovereign begins to feel outdated to them. Yet on the ground, life remains stubbornly complex. People adapt. They comply when necessary. They resist when possible. They remember old routes, even as new roads appear. Tartaria does not vanish. It compresses, and compression creates tension. By the end of this chapter, you feel that tension everywhere. In the uneasy calm of newly established forts, in the careful politeness of treaties signed under watchful eyes, in the way maps grow denser with symbols and thinner with imagination. You realize now that the redefinition of Tartaria is not a single act, but a process of listening and responding, where the state listens for weakness and Tartaria listens for ways to endure. As you move forward, you carry with you a deepening understanding. When power learns to speak softly and write carefully, it can change the meaning of an entire world without ever raising its voice. You hear them before you can place them in any ledger. Hooves moving faster than paperwork. Laughter, arguments, songs carried by wind. The Cossacks do not arrive like officials, and they do not leave like armies. They appear where maps hesitate, where authority wants presence but not responsibility. And in that hesitation, they thrive. You ride with them now, not as a commander, but as a witness. They are settlers and raiders, scouts and farmers, loyal and unruly all at once. The state speaks of them as instruments, but you can feel how inaccurate that word is. Instruments are controlled. The Cossacks are tolerated, encouraged, occasionally punished, rarely understood. This ambiguity makes them powerful. They move ahead of formal borders, ahead of administration, ahead of law. Where they settle, reality changes before the state has time to name it. A winter camp becomes a village. A fishing spot becomes a crossing. A rumor becomes a claim. Tartaria does not know how to defend itself against this kind of advance, because it does not look like conquest. You notice how useful this is to Moscow. If the Cossacks succeed, the land is later secured. If they fail, they are disavowed. Their actions test the limits of the possible without forcing the state to commit openly. Expansion becomes plausible deniability. And Tartaria feels this shift deeply. The steppe, once defined by seasonal movement, now encounters permanent intrusion that does not announce itself as authority. The Cossacks build, farm, intermarry, fight, retreat, return. They blur the line between inside and outside. Tartaria, which relied on that line remaining vague, begins to lose its depth. You ask yourself, how do you resist something that refuses to admit what it is? Cossack settlements generate facts on the ground. Facts are dangerous things. They demand explanation, protection, integration. The state follows behind them with paperwork, laws, and boundaries, claiming it is merely organizing what already exists. Tartaria is reduced again, not by decree, but by precedent. You feel the cultural tension sharpen. The Cossacks adopt aspects of steppe life while insisting on their own identity. They are familiar enough to move freely, foreign enough to disrupt. To the peoples of Tartaria, they feel like neighbors who never quite leave, guests who quietly rearrange the house. Violence erupts sporadically. Raids answered by raids. Agreements broken, remade, broken again. Each conflict is small enough to be dismissed, but together they form a steady erosion. Tartaria's spaces of neutrality shrink. There is always someone nearby now, someone watching, someone claiming familiarity with the land. European observers struggle to describe this. Their maps lag behind reality. They still write Tartary, but now they add notes, settled by Cossacks, influenced by Russia, contested. The word Tartaria survives, but it is increasingly crowded with explanations that weaken it. You notice how identity itself begins to fracture. Some communities align with the newcomers, others move farther away. Some attempt to formalize their status, seeking recognition within the expanding system. Each choice is a response to pressure, and each response pulls Tartaria into smaller, more defined shapes. The Cossacks themselves resist control even as they enable it. They rebel, they negotiate, they demand privileges. Their unpredictability forces the state to refine its methods. More rules, more classifications, more clarity. Tartaria pays the price for this refinement. You walk through a settlement that did not exist a generation ago. It feels ordinary. That is the most unsettling part. What once would have been remarkable now feels inevitable. Tartaria is losing not just land, but surprise. As this chapter draws to a close, you understand that expansion no longer needs orders from above. It has acquired momentum. People move because they can, because others already have, because the unknown has been made approachable. And you realize something quietly profound. When the frontier fills with familiar faces, the name Tartaria begins to sound unnecessary. Not wrong, just excessive. You move onward, sensing that the world ahead will be measured more carefully, regulated more tightly, and remembered less generously. You wake to the sound of axes in frozen wood. Not the sharp crack of battle, but the steady, patient rhythm of construction. Siberia is not taken in a single moment, because Siberia does not allow haste. It is taken the way winter settles, quietly, repeatedly, without asking permission. One fort at a time, one season at a time, one decision made simply to survive another night. You move with the builders now, feeling the cold settle deep into bone. These outposts are not cities. They are statements of endurance. Timber walls, watchtowers, storehouses packed with grain and salt. Each fort is placed just far enough from the last to remain reachable, just close enough to remain defensible. Between them, Tartaria still stretches wide, but the gaps are shrinking. You notice how deliberate this method is. The state does not attempt to control the vastness all at once. It punctures it. Each fort is a nail driven into uncertainty. Around each nail, activity gathers. Traders arrive. Hunters register. Taxes are assessed. What was once a seasonal meeting place becomes a permanent node. And permanence changes everything. You feel how Siberia resists being named. Forests swallow paths. Rivers split and rejoin without warning. Snow erases memory. Yet even here, the habit of recording persists. Distances are measured. Resources are catalogued. Peoples are listed, often incorrectly, but listed nonetheless. Tartaria, which once thrived beyond precise description, is now being described whether it agrees or not. You pause and sense the psychological shift this creates. To live beyond forts is to feel increasingly peripheral. To live near them is to feel increasingly observed. Neutrality becomes harder to maintain. Even silence begins to look suspicious. The forts are not always welcomed. Resistance flares. Posts are burned. Garrisons are attacked. But each incident produces more response. More soldiers, stronger walls, clearer rules. Siberia teaches the state patience, and patience teaches the state persistence. You walk through a newly established post and notice how ordinary it feels inside. Schedules, rations, duties. Even here, far from the center, the same expectations apply. The state does not adapt to the land. It insists the land adapt to it. Tartaria's flexibility meets a system that refuses to bend. You hear officials speak of Siberia as a resource frontier. Furs first, then minerals, then labor. Each category reduces complexity into value. Tartaria is no longer a space of stories. It is a balance sheet, and balance sheets have little tolerance for ambiguity. European observers begin to struggle again. Their maps show Tartaria receding eastward, chased by Russian place names that multiply rapidly. Tobolsk, Tomsk, Yeniseisk. Each name marks not just a settlement, but a claim that this land now belongs to a narrative with dates and administrators. You notice how the word Tartaria survives mostly where forts have not yet reached. It clings to blank spaces, to margins, to areas still resisting inscription. The name begins to function like a warning label. Here be uncertainty. But uncertainty is now targeted. You feel the emotional toll on those who live between forts. Some adapt, entering the new system to avoid exclusion. Others retreat deeper into forests and tundra. Tartaria fractures again, not because it is defeated, but because it is being compressed from multiple directions at once. By the end of this chapter, you stand on a ridge overlooking a chain of distant outposts, faint lights flickering against endless dark. Each light is small, insignificant on its own. Together, they form a pattern, a slow constellation replacing an older sky. You understand now that Siberia is not conquered by force of arms, but by force of repetition. And repetition, once established, is difficult to undo. Tartaria still exists beyond the glow, but it now lives mostly in the spaces between lights, spaces that grow smaller each year, each winter, each quietly recorded success. You begin to notice that the most powerful weapon is no longer a sword or a cannon, but a ledger. Thick, heavy, bound in leather, carried carefully through snow and mud. The fur ledger. It does not look dangerous. It looks dull, and that is why it works. You stand beside officials as they open it, page by page. Each line records a payment. Each payment represents a hunt, a journey, a life spent moving through forests and rivers that once answered only to seasons. Now they answer to columns, numbers, obligations. Tartaria is learning a new language, and this language does not care how the land feels. Fur is not just wealth. It is leverage. It turns wilderness into yield, and yield into expectation. What was once offered as tribute becomes required. What was once negotiated becomes standardized. The ledger transforms relationships into routines, and routines into law. You feel how quietly this happens. No announcement declares that Tartaria is now an economic system. It simply becomes one through repetition. Year after year, quotas are set. Shortfalls are noted. Punishments are implied even when not spoken aloud. The land is no longer vast. It is productive, and productivity demands accountability. You watch how hunters are counted, not as individuals, but as units of output. Their routes are mapped. Their movements anticipated. Even failure is recorded because failure, too, teaches the state how to tighten its grip. Tartaria's openness is replaced by expectation, and expectation is a heavy thing to carry. You pause, and feel the moral shift embedded in this system. The land is no longer encountered as a living space, but as a resource field. Animals become inventory. Rivers become corridors of extraction. Forests become assets. The old stories still exist, but they no longer matter in official space. The ledger does not listen. You sense how this new scripture spreads. It is copied, referenced, archived. Decisions are made not by elders or weather, but by past entries. The future is now shaped by what has already been written. Tartaria, which thrived on adaptability, finds itself trapped by its own recorded past. European markets drive this process from afar. Demand rises. Prices fluctuate. Pressure increases. The steppe and forest are drawn into a global rhythm they cannot see, only feel. Tartaria is no longer distant. It is connected, and connection brings vulnerability. You hear officials speak with satisfaction about efficiency, about predictability, about progress. These words sound clean and reassuring. They leave no room for grief, no room for loss, no room for the quiet disappearance of ways of life that cannot be monetized. Resistance, when it appears, is framed as delinquency, as failure to deliver, as refusal to participate in improvement. The language is clever. It turns defiance into deficiency. Tartaria is no longer resisting domination. It is failing an obligation. You realize how powerful this framing is. It removes the need for moral debate. The ledger does not argue. It only notes compliance or non-compliance. And once a system no longer argues, it no longer listens. You walk through a settlement where fur quotas have reshaped daily life. Conversations revolve around numbers now, about how much was taken, how much remains, how much is owed. Fear changes form. It is no longer fear of the unknown. It is fear of shortage, of punishment, of being marked unreliable. The word Tartaria feels increasingly out of place here. What does it mean in a world measured so precisely? It survives only as a geographic habit, a leftover label for areas not yet fully accounted for. The ledger, unlike the map, does not tolerate blank space. You notice how children grow up inside this system. They learn early that survival is tied to compliance. That movement must be justified. That freedom has a cost calculated elsewhere. Tartaria's future generations are being trained to think in terms that would have felt alien only decades before. And still, the state insists this is order, not conquest. You look again at the ledger and understand its true power. It does not just record reality, it creates it. What is written becomes what matters. What is not written fades. Tartaria, once vast enough to escape description, is now slowly being written out of its own story. By the end of this chapter, you feel a quiet heaviness settle in. Not despair, but inevitability. The ledger closes with a soft thud, and in that sound you hear something final, a rhythm that will repeat year after year, regardless of who lives or dies, regardless of what names survive in memory. You realize now that Tartaria is not being defeated by violence, but by accounting, by the steady belief that everything worth keeping must be measurable. And you wonder, as the pages turn and the ink dries, what happens to a world when nothing meaningful is allowed to remain uncounted? You begin to notice how words grow heavier as they grow smaller. Where once there were peoples, there are now categories. Where once there were clans, there are now entries. The transformation does not arrive as insult. It arrives as classification. And classification, you are learning, is one of the most effective ways to make a world manageable. You listen as officials speak of subjects. The word sounds neutral, almost polite. It implies protection, belonging, order. But it also implies hierarchy, someone above, someone below. Tartaria, which once described a vast and living complexity, is now filtered through this single relationship. Subject to whom? Subject to what? You walk through records where entire communities are reduced to labels: payer, convert, nomad, settled, loyal, unreliable. Each label carries consequences. Some bring privileges, others bring suspicion. None allow a return to ambiguity. Identity is being pressed flat, like a leaf between pages, preserved, but no longer alive. You feel how this flattening works quietly. No one announces that a people has become a footnote. It happens when their name appears only once in a report, then again in a summary, then only as a number in a table. Context disappears first. Voice follows. Memory lingers briefly, then fades. You ask yourself softly, when a people is remembered only through the obligations they failed or fulfilled, what part of them survives? The state insists this process is inclusive. Everyone is counted. Everyone is recorded. But inclusion here does not mean understanding. It means incorporation. The system does not ask how people live. It asks how they can be fitted. Those who fit easily are praised. Those who do not are marked as problems. You see how former leaders are reassigned roles. Some become intermediaries. Others become ceremonial figures. Their authority is recognized only insofar as it serves administration. Power that once flowed through custom is rerouted through approval. Tartaria's internal hierarchies are not destroyed. They are repurposed. This repurposing creates fractures. Communities begin to argue among themselves. Who benefits from compliance? Who pays the cost? Identity, once flexible, becomes contested. To be categorized one way rather than another now matters deeply. Labels determine taxes, movement, punishment, favor. Tartaria is no longer a shared space. It is a contested one. You feel the emotional toll of this shift. Older generations remember a time before these distinctions mattered. Younger ones grow up inside them. Memory itself becomes uneven. What was once common knowledge becomes nostalgia, then irrelevance. European observers play their part. Their writings increasingly treat the peoples of Tartaria as ethnographic subjects rather than political actors. Costumes are noted, habits are described, but agency is quietly removed. Tartaria becomes something to be studied, not something that decides. You notice how dangerous this is. Once a people is framed as an object of study, it no longer threatens power. It can be summarized, displayed, archived. Footnotes replace voices. Illustrations replace negotiations. Resistance continues, but it is reframed again. No longer rebellion, but disorder. No longer conflict, but backwardness. The language tightens, leaving no room for alternative interpretations. Tartaria is not opposing the future. It is failing to catch up with it. You stand in a settlement where names spoken aloud differ from names written down. Official titles replace ancestral ones. Some accept this easily. Others feel something essential slipping away, though they struggle to articulate what it is. Loss is harder to name than conquest. You sense that this is one of the most decisive moments in the redefinition of Tartaria. Not when land is taken, not when forts are built, but when identity itself is reorganized to fit someone else's system. By the end of this chapter, Tartaria feels thinner, not smaller on the map, but lighter in meaning, less able to assert itself as a coherent idea. It survives now in fragments, customs, songs, memories, while official space fills with categories that leave no room for contradiction. And as you move onward, you carry a quiet realization. A world can endure invasion, exploitation, even violence. But when it is reduced to footnotes, it begins to disappear without anyone noticing. You begin to hear bells where there were none before. Their sound is slow, measured, carried far across open land. Mission bells. They do not shout. They do not hurry. They repeat, patiently, as if confident that time itself is on their side. And in many ways, it is. You walk with the missionaries as they travel along the same routes as soldiers and officials. They speak of salvation, of order, of unity. Their language is softer than the state's, but it moves in the same direction. Faith arrives not as replacement, but as alignment. To believe correctly is to belong correctly. You feel how carefully this is framed. Conversion is presented as choice, as opportunity, as care for the soul. And often, it is accepted sincerely. People are not empty vessels. They search for meaning as much as protection. But belief here does more than comfort. It reorganizes loyalty. Churches rise near forts, near administrative centers, near roads. Their placement is not accidental. Sacred space mirrors political space. To attend is to gather. To gather is to be seen. To be seen is to be counted. Tartaria, which once practiced belief across open sky and moving seasons, is being asked to kneel in fixed locations at fixed times. You pause and feel the subtle discipline embedded in ritual. Calendars replace cycles. Feast days replace migrations. Confession replaces negotiation. The land's rhythm yields to a timetable written elsewhere. This is not forced uniformly, but it spreads steadily, one community at a time. You notice how missionaries become translators of language, of custom, of intent. They explain the state to the people and the people to the state. This position gives them power, even when they deny it. What they choose to emphasize, what they choose to omit, shapes perception on both sides. Tartaria's spiritual diversity does not vanish overnight. Old practices continue quietly. Syncretism flourishes. Symbols overlap. But official recognition flows in only one direction. The closer belief aligns with imperial norms, the more protection it receives. Faith becomes another ledger, another metric of reliability. You ask yourself gently, what happens to a worldview when its gods are no longer legible to authority? European writers take note of these changes with interest. They describe the spread of Christianity as progress, as enlightenment. Tartaria, in their accounts, appears less mysterious now, more familiar. Familiarity, however, comes at a cost. The land loses its voice as something other than a mission field. You walk through a village where old stories are now whispered, told only at night, passed between generations with caution. Public space belongs to the new order. Private space holds memory. Tartaria survives here, but in retreat, like a language spoken only at home. The state welcomes this shift. Unified belief simplifies governance. Shared rituals reinforce hierarchy. A common moral vocabulary reduces friction. Religion becomes a stabilizing force, not because it eliminates conflict, but because it channels it into acceptable forms. You sense how resistance is reframed yet again. Those who reject conversion are no longer just politically inconvenient. They are spiritually suspect. This adds a new weight to dissent. To resist the state now risks being cast as resisting salvation itself. Yet belief is never fully controllable. Some converts reinterpret teachings through older lenses. Some missionaries grow sympathetic to local ways. Tensions arise between doctrine and reality. But these tensions play out within a structure that already assumes the legitimacy of expansion. Tartaria is not allowed to define the terms of this dialogue. By the end of this chapter, the bells continue to ring, steady and calm. They do not erase the old sky roads entirely, but they draw attention away from them. The sound marks territory not just on land, but in time. You realize now that the redefinition of Tartaria is reaching into the unseen, beyond borders, beyond taxes, into belief itself. And when belief changes, memory soon follows. As you move forward, you carry the quiet understanding that empires do not only conquer land, they teach people how to imagine the world. And once imagination is guided, resistance becomes harder to even conceive. You find yourself leaning over a table again, but this time the room is brighter. Windows are larger. Instruments are finer. Rulers, compasses, and grids lie neatly arranged, as if uncertainty itself has been invited inside and politely disarmed. This is where Tartaria begins to lose its last advantage, its refusal to be precise. Cartographers do not speak of conquest. They speak of accuracy. You watch as lines are drawn slowly, confidently, across parchment. Rivers are straightened. Mountains are tamed into symbols. Vast regions once labeled with a single breathing word are divided into provinces, districts, governorships. Each new line feels small. Together, they change everything. Tartaria does not disappear here. It is segmented until it no longer feels whole. You notice how satisfying this process appears to those doing it. Ambiguity resolves into geometry. The unknown becomes manageable. A place that once demanded stories can now be summarized with coordinates. The map stops asking questions. It starts giving answers. You feel how this affects power. Once land is mapped, it can be planned. Once planned, it can be exploited. Once exploited, it can be defended. The map becomes a promise that what is shown can be controlled. Tartaria, which once lived beyond promise, is now expected to comply. European mapmakers eagerly participate. Their atlases reflect a growing confidence in Russian knowledge. Where earlier editions hedged with broad labels, new ones show detail. Roads, towns, borders. Tartaria shrinks not because land is lost, but because explanation expands. The more that is known, the less room there is for a name that implies mystery. You ask yourself quietly, when does knowledge become possession? The act of naming accelerates. Old place names are replaced or transliterated, smoothed into forms more convenient for imperial tongues. Some survive in footnotes, others vanish entirely. Language itself becomes terrain. To rename is to assert memory over memory. You sense how this reshaping feels inevitable from the drafting table. From above, everything aligns. From above, resistance looks like error. The cartographer does not see seasonal movement, oral agreements, spiritual landmarks. Those do not fit the scale. Tartaria's reality is lost not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient to draw. You walk through a region now divided into clean administrative shapes. On the ground, nothing has changed physically. The same winds blow, the same paths are walked. But something invisible presses down. Expectations, Jurisdictions. Authorities who claim relevance because the map says so. The state begins to trust the map more than the land itself. Decisions are made far away, based on symbols rather than experience. Tartaria becomes a problem of management rather than a place of life. This distance makes redefinition easier. It is easier to erase a name when you no longer hear it spoken. You notice how the word Tartaria lingers longest in foreign works, even as it fades from domestic use. Outsiders cling to it, sometimes romantically, sometimes ignorantly. Inside the empire, it sounds outdated, imprecise, almost embarrassing. Progress, after all, prefers cleaner terms. Yet even here, traces remain. Marginal notes, disputed lines, areas marked uncertain. The map pretends to be complete, but it knows it is not. Tartaria survives in these gaps, in the quiet acknowledgments that not everything has been mastered. By the end of this chapter, you feel the power of the drawn line settle into place. Not dramatic, not violent, just final in its own way. The map rolls up, the ink dries, and the room empties. And you realize that once a place has been fully mapped, it no longer belongs to itself. It belongs to whoever holds the map, and to whatever story the map is designed to tell. You drift westward now, not in body, but in attention, into rooms warmed by candles and conversation. European salons, study halls, printing rooms where ideas travel faster than armies ever could. Here, Tartaria is not lived in. It is discussed. And discussion, you sense, is another form of control. You listen as scholars and gentlemen speak confidently about lands they will never see. They unfold maps, compare travelogues, quote one another. The word Tartaria still appears, but it is no longer spoken with awe. It is spoken with classification, with modifiers, with explanation marks. Great Tartary, Lesser Tartary, Asiatic Tartars, Russian Tartary. Each phrase sounds helpful, clarifying, civilized, but each one fractures the original meaning. Tartaria, once a single vast uncertainty, is now broken into digestible concepts. The unknown is being domesticated by vocabulary. You feel how distance makes this possible. From far away, complexity flattens easily. European thinkers are not malicious. Many are curious, sincere. But they rely on second-hand knowledge filtered through imperial reports. They trust maps already drawn, terms already chosen. Their work reinforces decisions made elsewhere. You notice how Tartaria becomes less a place and more an idea, a backdrop for theories about race, climate, civilization. The people who live there are no longer primary actors. They are examples, illustrations, evidence used to support arguments formed far from the steppe. And once a land becomes an example, it stops being allowed to contradict the theory built upon it. You hear debates about progress, about stages of development, about which societies are advanced and which are behind. Tartaria is positioned carefully within these frameworks, not as a peer, but as a reference point for what modernity is not. The word survives, but only as contrast. You pause and ask yourself, what happens when a place is remembered only for what others think it lacks? Travel writers contribute eagerly. Their accounts are selective, shaped by expectations. They describe what seems strange, what confirms existing beliefs. Familiarity is ignored. Normalcy is unremarkable. Tartaria becomes exotic by omission, a world stripped of nuance. Maps printed in Europe reinforce this vision. Tartaria appears segmented, annotated, footnoted. The bold confidence of earlier centuries fades. In its place are explanations that suggest resolution. The mystery is declared solved, even if nothing was truly understood. You sense how this external reframing feeds back into Russian administration. European recognition matters. To be seen as modern, the empire must appear orderly, unified, defined. The lingering vagueness of Tartaria becomes a liability in international eyes. Better to present provinces than mysteries. So the name is allowed to wither politely. You notice how official Russian usage declines. Tartaria sounds archaic in courtly language now. Bureaucrats prefer precise terms that signal control. To continue using Tartaria would suggest uncertainty, and uncertainty suggests weakness. Yet paradoxically, in Europe, Tartaria lingers longer. It becomes a romantic leftover, a shadow on old maps, a word that evokes caravans, nomads, lost cities. Detached from reality, it becomes safe, harmless, decorative. You feel the danger in this transformation. When a place becomes romanticized, it is no longer defended. When it becomes theoretical, it is no longer heard. Tartaria is now something one can imagine without consequence. You walk through a library and see shelves of books that speak about Tartaria without ever speaking to it. The people themselves are absent, their voices replaced by summaries, their futures decided by trends and assumptions. By the end of this chapter, you realize that Tartaria is being dismantled not only by expansion, but by explanation, by being neatly fit into categories that leave no room for surprise. The world is learning how to talk about Tartaria in the past tense, even while it still exists. And as you turn away from the murmuring salons and close the heavy books, you feel a quiet chill. Sometimes the most effective erasure happens not when a name is forbidden, but when it is politely explained away. You move east again, toward a line that did not always exist. A line drawn not by rivers or mountains, but by negotiation, pressure, and patience. This is where Tartaria is forced to split in two, not by culture, not by belief, but by administration. The Qing border does not announce itself with drama. It arrives as agreement. You stand at the edge of two expanding systems, both convinced of their own order. To the north, the Russian Empire measures land with forts, ledgers, and maps. To the south, the Qing state organizes space through tribute, hierarchy, and ritual authority. Between them once lay a vast continuity. Now, that continuity must choose sides or be cut. You feel how unnatural this division is to the land itself. Routes that once flowed without interruption now pause at checkpoints. Communities that once shifted allegiance seasonally are asked to declare permanence. Tartaria, which existed comfortably as a gradient, is being forced into categories that require edges. The treaties speak calmly, carefully. They use language of mutual respect, of balance, of peace. But beneath every clause lies an assumption that the space between must be stabilized, defined so clearly that it no longer invites movement without permission. Stability, you sense, is another word for stillness. You watch how the border hardens over time. Markers are placed, patrols established, records synchronized. What was once a shared frontier becomes a seam where two worldviews press against each other. Tartaria is no longer a single exterior. It is now divided into zones of influence. You pause and ask yourself, can a place survive when it is split by definitions that do not come from it? The people living along this new line feel the change immediately. Some are claimed twice. Others are forced to choose an affiliation that does not reflect how they live. Old routes become suspicious. Old habits become violations. Tartaria's fluidity, once its strength, now marks it as disorderly to both sides. European observers interpret this division as progress. Clear borders mean maturity, civilization. The disappearance of Tartaria from the center of maps is treated as a sign that knowledge has finally triumphed over confusion. Few ask what has been lost in the process. You sense how this split accelerates the word's decline. Tartaria can no longer claim coherence. If it exists on both sides of an imperial border, then it exists properly in neither. It becomes a residual term, useful only when precision fails. The Qing administration does not adopt the name. Russian officials abandon it gradually. Between them, Tartaria falls through the cracks of language. It survives only in memory, in older documents, in the habits of those who still move as if the border were not there. But borders, once drawn, teach others how to see. You watch how future maps reinforce this division. Color blocks replace gradients. Labels obey lines. The old vastness of Tartaria cannot be represented anymore without contradicting the new order. So it is left out. Not denied, just ignored. By the end of this chapter, you feel a quiet finality settle in. Not an ending, but a ceiling. Tartaria has been cut into administratively acceptable pieces, its unity broken not by war, but by agreement. And you understand now that sometimes the most profound losses occur not in moments of conflict, but in moments of consensus, when everyone agrees that a name is no longer necessary because the systems on either side no longer need it. You feel the tempo change now. The pauses grow shorter. Decisions arrive faster. The state no longer moves like a cautious traveler. It moves like a planner. This is Peter's world. A world that believes time can be disciplined, space standardized, and history improved through design. Peter does not argue with Tartaria. He ignores it. You walk through workshops filled with rulers, clocks, IFMs, and charts. Everything is being measured. Height, rank, distance, time. The old world of inherited custom and negotiated meaning feels unbearably slow to him. He wants systems that function regardless of who lives inside them. And that desire reshapes everything it touches. You notice how language shifts under his reforms. Old regional terms feel imprecise, embarrassing. The state prefers words that imply control. Province, district, governorate. Tartaria, with its vagueness and depth, cannot survive this preference. It does not fit into columns. It resists being optimized. So it is quietly set aside. You see how administration spreads like a grid across the land. Officials are trained, ranked, rotated. Loyalty is no longer personal. It is institutional. This matters deeply for spaces that once relied on flexible authority. Tartaria's networks of allegiance dissolve under a system that demands permanence and documentation. You feel how relentless this is. There is no debate about whether a region should be reorganized. There is only discussion of how quickly it can be done. Peter's vision does not tolerate hesitation. The past is something to be corrected, not consulted. Maps are redrawn again, not to explore, but to regulate. Borders are refined. Names are standardized. Inconsistent spellings are eliminated. Local variations are smoothed out. Tartaria, already weakened, now feels almost anachronistic, a relic from a time before improvement became policy. You pause and ask yourself, what happens to memory when efficiency becomes virtue? The military reforms reinforce this shift. Regiments replace levies. Uniforms replace clan markings. Command structures replace negotiation. Space is now defended systematically, not reactively. Tartaria's old advantage, its unpredictability, loses relevance in a world designed to anticipate everything. You walk through towns that now look similar, regardless of where you are. Administrative buildings follow patterns. Streets are planned. Schedules enforced. This sameness is not accidental. It signals order. It reassures outsiders. It tells Europe that Russia belongs to the modern world. And modern worlds do not admit vague geographies. European observers respond enthusiastically. They praise reforms. They update atlases. Tartaria recedes further, replaced by precise subdivisions that reflect bureaucratic confidence. The name survives only in older references, spoken with a hint of condescension. A misunderstanding, now resolved. You feel the cultural pressure intensify. Local elites adopt imperial manners to maintain influence. Education aligns with state needs. History is retold with cleaner arcs. Tartaria becomes a prelude rather than a presence, a vague before-time that makes modern order appear inevitable. You notice how this retelling removes agency. Tartaria is no longer something that interacted with Russia. It is something Russia moved past. A phase, a shadow. The complexity of coexistence is replaced by a narrative of progress. Yet beneath this smooth surface, friction remains. Some practices refuse to disappear. Seasonal movement persists where terrain demands it. Old loyalties survive quietly. Names linger in speech even when absent from documents. Tartaria endures as habit rather than concept. But habit without recognition slowly weakens. By the end of this chapter, you sense how decisive this moment is. Not because of violence, but because of vision. Peter's reforms teach the empire to see itself as a machine, one that must run smoothly, predictably, without ambiguity. In such a machine, Tartaria has no function. You step back and realize that from this point on, the word will feel increasingly out of place. Not forbidden, just unnecessary. And in a world obsessed with improvement, what is unnecessary is rarely preserved. As you drift toward the next stretch of the journey, you carry a quiet understanding. When a state learns to worship efficiency, it does not need to destroy the old world. It simply designs a new one so thoroughly that the old cannot find a place to stand. You feel the empire settle into itself now, heavier, more confident, less hurried. Catherine's world is not about invention, but consolidation. What has been reached must be held. What has been renamed must be stabilized. And what still resists clarity must finally be brought into order. Gently, legally, permanently. You walk through halls where laws are spoken with elegance. Charters, statutes, commissions. Catherine does not ride the frontier. She absorbs it. Her power moves through councils and correspondence, through carefully phrased documents that promise fairness while fixing outcomes in advance. Tartaria is not challenged here. It is absorbed into language that no longer acknowledges it as separate. You notice how the steppe is invited in, not as equal, but as material for reform. Local elites are summoned. Their customs are acknowledged, then reframed. Rights are granted, but only after being defined. Representation is offered, but within structures designed elsewhere. This inclusion feels generous, and in many ways it is. But it comes with a quiet condition. Whatever joins the system must accept its logic. You sense how effective this is. Resistance softens when it is addressed politely. Autonomy fades when it is honored ceremonially. Tartaria, once resistant because it could not be grasped, now finds itself held gently but firmly, like something precious that is no longer allowed to move freely. You walk through newly codified regions. Councils meet. Regulations are posted. Jurisdictions clarified. The language is calm, reassuring, final. There is no mention of conquest, no hint of loss. Only improvement, rationalization, harmony. You ask yourself softly, can something be taken away if everyone agrees it is for the best? Catherine's reforms extend deeper than borders. They reach into daily life. Land tenure is formalized. Obligations standardized. Appeals redirected upward. The state presents itself as protector, arbiter, benefactor. Tartaria's older systems of mediation, flexible, local, personal, are gradually sidelined as inefficient. Efficiency returns as a moral value. You notice how education spreads this logic. Schools teach loyalty to institutions rather than to place. History is reorganized into narratives that flow toward the present. Tartaria appears briefly, vaguely, then recedes. It is no longer a living context. It is a background condition that civilization corrected. European observers admire this Polish. They speak of enlightened rule, of legal order reaching the margins. Their praise reinforces the process. Tartaria's disappearance becomes proof of success. Something undefined has finally been clarified. You feel the emotional quiet of this moment. There is little open conflict. Life continues. People adapt. Many benefit. Roads improve. Markets stabilize. The cost is not immediately visible, which makes it easier to accept. But beneath the surface, something subtle is gone. You walk through a village where disputes are now settled by distant courts. The outcomes are consistent, predictable. And yet, people speak less during these proceedings. They wait, they comply. Their participation is procedural, not creative. Tartaria's old habit of negotiation fades into silence. You sense how rebellion now looks unnecessary, even irrational. The system appears fair. The rules are written. To object feels childish, backward. Tartaria's last refuge, its moral ambiguity, is framed as immaturity. By the end of this chapter, you feel the steppe growing quieter, not from peace, but from resignation. The empire hums smoothly. The language of order fills every gap. There is no need to mention Tartaria anymore because everything has been placed somewhere else. You realize now that this may be the most complete redefinition of all. Not the taking of land, not the drawing of borders, but the successful persuasion of an entire space that it no longer needs to be named as it once was. And as you move onward, you carry a gentle unease. When order feels this calm, it is often because all alternative ways of being have learned to speak only in whispers. You feel the calm crack before you hear it break. Order, once settled, begins to feel heavy, predictable, suffocating. Rebellion does not announce itself as ideology. It arrives as fatigue, as resentment quietly shared, as memory that refuses to stay buried beneath paperwork. You hear it in rumors first, then in songs sung a little too loudly, then in gatherings that last longer than permitted. The steppe, though quiet, has not forgotten how to move. Tartaria stirs not as a name, but as an instinct. When rebellion flares, it is sudden and uneven. Not a single uprising, but many. Different grievances, different leaders, different hopes. Yet to the state, they all look the same. Disorder. And disorder, once identified, must be corrected. You watch how swiftly the response arrives, not just with troops, but with ink. After each uprising, the archive grows heavier. New decrees, revised regulations, clearer definitions of loyalty and treason. Rebellion becomes not a question of cause, but of classification. The state does not ask why, it asks where to file it. You feel the irony settle in. Resistance, meant to assert autonomy, accelerates control. Each flare justifies tighter oversight. Each act of defiance produces more clarity. Tartaria's last refuge, its unpredictability, is turned against it. You walk through regions freshly pacified. Soldiers depart. Officials remain. Their presence is quieter, more permanent. New boundaries are drawn around behavior. Travel requires permission. Assemblies are monitored. Even silence is observed. The language of records hardens. Words like unruly, primitive, incorrigible appear more frequently. They are efficient words. They do not require understanding. Once applied, they explain everything in advance. You ask yourself quietly, how do you argue with a system that has already decided what you are? European observers note these rebellions with detached interest. They describe them as growing pains, as evidence that modernization is working. Tartaria appears in their writing only as a residue of resistance, a fading shadow that occasionally interrupts progress. The state responds by simplifying history further. Texts are revised, narratives smoothed. The rebellions are framed as last gasps of an outdated world. Tartaria is no longer something to be understood. It is something to be gotten over. You notice how fear changes shape again. It is no longer fear of invasion or punishment, but fear of being marked, of appearing unreliable in records that never forget. People learn to perform loyalty, to say less, to blend in. Memory retreats into private space. You walk through a family home where stories are told softly, if at all. Children are taught which words belong outside and which must stay inside. Tartaria survives here only as tone, as gesture, as things felt rather than named. The archive, meanwhile, grows confident. Its categories expand. Its reach deepens. It becomes the final authority on what exists and what matters. What is not archived begins to feel unreal. By the end of this chapter, you sense a profound shift. Resistance has not disappeared, but it has lost its language. Without a name, without a recognized identity, it cannot gather. Tartaria, once a word that held multitudes, is now too diffuse to rally around. You stand at the edge of the record room, listening to pages turn. Each page feels final, not because it tells the truth, but because it decides what will be remembered. And you realize that when rebellion is answered not with debate but with documentation, the struggle does not end. It simply moves into silence, where it is hardest to hear and easiest to forget. You notice how the word begins to sound strange in your mouth now. Tartaria. It no longer points to anything living. It points backward, toward cabinets, not landscapes, toward glass cases, not horizons. The label has survived, but only just enough to be displayed. You walk through halls of preservation, museums, ethnographic collections, illustrated volumes meant to explain the past to a polite, curious audience. Here, Tartaria is safe, neutralized, arranged. Its danger has been removed by context. Costumes are mounted carefully. Tools are labeled. Practices are described in the past tense, even when they still exist beyond the walls. The message is subtle but firm. This world has already concluded. What remains is residue, worthy of study, but not of participation. You feel how this transformation completes a long process. Tartaria is no longer a rival geography. It is a cultural artifact, something that happened, something that helps explain how the present came to be. It has been moved from politics into pedagogy. And pedagogy, you sense, is where memory goes to rest. You read descriptions written with care and distance. The Tartars believed the Tartarian way of life was. Each sentence seals the label further into the past. No one asks whether the belief still shapes daily life. No one asks whether the way of life adapted rather than vanished. The display does not need answers. It needs coherence. You pause and ask yourself softly, when a living culture is described as completed, who decides that it is finished? European audiences find these exhibits fascinating, exotic, comfortably distant. Tartaria becomes a theme, an aesthetic, a curiosity, something to be admired without obligation, without consequence. The word survives here precisely because it no longer threatens anything. You notice how the state benefits from this framing. What is archived no longer resists. What is displayed no longer speaks back. Tartaria's final transformation is not into enemy or subject, but into example. Even language reflects this shift. Tartar becomes stereotype, simplified, flattened, detached from specific people or places. It floats freely, available for metaphor, insult, or romance, depending on context. Precision is no longer required, because accuracy is no longer the goal. You walk through classrooms where children learn of Tartaria as a vague chapter, quickly passed over. A name mentioned briefly, then replaced by clearer terms, regions, nations, empires. The old ambiguity is framed as ignorance that progress has corrected. You feel the quiet finality of this. Not anger, not grief, something more muted. Tartaria has not been disproven. It has been outgrown. And yet, outside the halls and pages, life continues in forms that do not quite match the exhibits. Customs persist. Roots endure. Memories resist alignment. But without a recognized name, these continuities struggle to assert meaning. They are treated as survivals, not as presences. You realize now that this is one of the most complete erasures imaginable. To allow a name to survive, but only as a museum tag, to preserve appearance while denying relevance. Tartaria is no longer denied. It is concluded. By the end of this chapter, you feel a strange stillness settle in. The displays are quiet. The labels are neat. The past has been arranged into something understandable, harmless, final. Oh. And you understand that when a world is placed behind glass, it does not vanish, but it can no longer move. It can no longer grow. It can no longer surprise. You step away slowly, carrying with you the unsettling thought that the most effective way to end a civilization is not to burn it, but to explain it, completely, politely, and forever in the past. You begin to hear a different sound now, not bells, not hooves, not the turning of pages. a long, low vibration that carries through earth and air alike. Iron on iron, steam exhaling, the sound of distance collapsing. Railways arrive without curiosity. They do not ask what the land is. They decide how it will be crossed. You stand beside the tracks as they cut through spaces once defined by time rather than speed. What once took weeks now takes days. What once required negotiation now requires a ticket. The land is no longer something you enter gradually. It is something you pass through. And Tartaria cannot survive being passed through. You feel how profoundly this changes perception. Distance was once Tartaria's shelter. The time it took to move created space for difference, for adaptation, for forgetting. Railways erase that buffer. They pull the step into the same temporal rhythm as the capital. Noon becomes universal. Schedules replace seasons. Telegraph wires follow soon after, thin and precise. Messages outrun messengers. Decisions arrive before context. Authority no longer waits to understand. It acts. The land becomes responsive, not conversational. You pause and ask yourself quietly, what happens to a place when it can no longer delay power? With iron and wire, the empire no longer imagines the step as far away. It imagines it as late, behind schedule, in need of synchronization. Tartaria, once defined by its own tempo, is now measured against clocks set elsewhere. You notice how administration accelerates. Orders travel faster than explanation. Mistakes are corrected immediately. Deviations are flagged. There is no time for ambiguity, no tolerance for pause. What once required presence now requires compliance. The railway stations feel strange. They are identical across vast distances. Same signs, same procedures, same uniforms. You stand in one and realize you could be anywhere. That sameness is the point. It tells you the land has been absorbed into a single operational space. European observers celebrate this transformation. They speak of connectivity, of civilization extending its reach. Tartaria, in their eyes, has finally been solved, not by understanding, but by infrastructure. The unknown has been outrun. You feel the emotional effect on those who live along the lines. Some benefit. Markets grow. Travel becomes possible in new ways. But something else tightens. Surveillance sharpens. Movement is logged. Identity becomes trackable. To exist is to leave a trace. Tartaria's old advantage, its ability to disappear between places, vanishes. You walk beside the tracks at night and notice how the darkness feels different. Less deep, less protective. Lights stretch farther now. Sound carries. The land no longer swallows presence. It reflects it. You hear how language adjusts again. Officials no longer speak of frontier. They speak of integration, of network, of system. Tartaria is not mentioned because systems do not have outside. Maps reflect this shift with brutal efficiency. Rail lines dominate. Telegraph routes are highlighted. Blank spaces vanish. What is connected is considered known. What is known is considered controlled. You realize now that this is not conquest in the old sense. It is enclosure. The world is being wrapped in lines that define how it can be used. Tartaria's refusal to be enclosed made it powerful once. Now it makes it incompatible. You notice how memory struggles here. Stories tied to journeys lose relevance when journeys are shortened. Place names fade when stops are standardized. Oral knowledge weakens when reference timetables replace experience. Children grow up thinking in stations rather than seasons. You feel the last traces of Tartaria retreat into places infrastructure avoids. Swamps, highlands, forest depths. But even these feel temporary. The lines always seem to be coming. By the end of this chapter, you stand at a crossing where rails intersect older paths. The older paths are still visible, worn into earth, but no one waits there anymore. All attention is on the track. You understand now that Tartaria does not vanish because it is defeated. It vanishes because the world becomes too fast for it to exist, too connected, too synchronized. And as the train passes, shaking the ground beneath your feet, you feel a quiet certainty. When speed becomes the measure of reality, anything that moves at its own pace is destined to be left unnamed, then unseen, then forgotten. You reach the end without crossing a clear line, because endings like this are never announced. There is no decree stating that Tartaria is finished. No official burial. No final map where the word is ceremonially erased. Instead, you arrive in a world where the name simply no longer comes up. You listen carefully for it, in documents, in conversations, in classrooms, in reports. But it has become unnecessary. Everything it once gestured toward now has another term. A province, a region, a district, a minority, a relic. Tartaria has not been defeated. It has been outlived by language. You walk through modern administrative spaces where efficiency hums quietly. Forms are processed. Data flows. Decisions are made without reference to old uncertainties. The system no longer remembers needing a word for vastness, because vastness itself has been solved, measured, connected, filed. You pause and feel the strange absence this creates. Not emptiness, order, smoothness, predictability. The kind of order that leaves no space for something undefined to stand. Tartaria once existed precisely because the world could not yet account for itself. Now, the world believes it can. You notice how historians speak carefully. They acknowledge Tartaria as a historical term, a cartographic convention, a misunderstanding. Their tone is gentle, reassuring. There is no hostility left, only closure. And closure, you realize, is often the most final act of all. You ask yourself the last quiet question of this long journey. Was Tartaria ever a place? Or was it the name we gave to what could not yet be owned? Perhaps it was both. You sense how the redefinition is complete, not because the land changed, but because perception did. The same winds still cross the steppe. The same stars still rise over forests and plains. But they no longer belong to a world allowed to exist outside systems. Everything now must fit somewhere. Tartaria does not fit anywhere anymore. It lingers only in old atlases, in mislabeled memories, in the feeling that something vast once existed without permission. A world where movement mattered more than borders. Where identity bent rather than broke. Where the unknown was not a problem to be solved, but a condition of life. You stand quietly with that thought and feel no urgency to resolve it. This story was never meant to convince you, only to walk with you through a slow transformation and let you feel its weight. Because perhaps Tartaria was not erased to hide something. Perhaps it was erased because the modern world no longer knows how to live with places that refuse to be fully explained. And as your thoughts begin to slow, the edges of the story soften. The maps fade back into paper. The rails grow quiet. The ledgers close. What remains is not a conclusion, but a gentle awareness that history is not only written by victors, but by administrators, cartographers, engineers, and teachers, all doing their work very well. Now the pace eases. Breaths lengthen. Sentences stretch. You are allowed to rest here at the end of a long road that did not feel like a road at all. Whatever Tartaria was, place, name, mirror, it no longer needs defending tonight. It can drift back into the soft margins where sleep lives, where questions do not demand answers, and where the mind is free to wander without coordinates. Let the world become quiet again.